Imagine waking up to frost creeping across your walls, your stomach growling from yesterday's thin meal of boiled turnip, and knowing that there's no store to run to, no electricity, no backup plan, just your wits, your family, and the land beneath your feet. That was daily life for medieval peasants, people often romanticized in textbooks or overlooked entirely, yet they were the original survivalists. Forget survival shows or modern prepping. These folks didn't do it for views or vanity. They did it because there was no other choice. Their lives weren't dominated by luxury, but by ingenuity sharpened by necessity. And what they figured out with nothing but fire, stone, and instinct might just save yours if everything ever fell apart. In this deep dive, we'll explore 15 forgotten survival tricks that not only helped medieval peasants endure plague, famine, brutal winters, and lawless lands, but could still be surprisingly relevant today. But first, let's debunk a myth. Medieval peasants weren't dumb or dirty by default. They were resourceful, deeply tied to the rhythms of nature, and constantly experimenting with ways to stretch limited resources. Many of the techniques we'll discuss weren't taught. They were discovered, passed down like heirlooms, tested in the crucible of survival. And some worked so well, they echoed into the 1800s and even modern times. Let's start with a technique so simple it sounds like a campfire gimmick, but for many, it meant the difference between eating and starving. Hot stone boiling. Now, if you didn't have access to metal pot sand, many didn't, you couldn't just slap a stew on the fire. But medieval peasants knew how to turn fire and rock into a makeshift stove. By heating up dry, dense stones, never river rocks, which explode from internal moisture, they could then drop those glowing hot stones into wooden bowls, animal skin bladders, or clay-lined holes filled with water. The heat transferred from stone to water, bubbling it to a boil. Just like that, you could cook soup, sterilize water, or warm your bones on a cold night. It wasn't elegant, but it worked. And for someone living in a time when dysentery could wipe out half a village, boiled water meant fewer funerals. In fact, some historians believe this trick likely started by accident. Maybe a farmer plucked a hot rock out of the fire and dropped it into a bucket of drinking water. Instead of scalding failure, it led to bubbling promise. Word would have spread faster than gossip at a harvest festival. In regions where iron was scarce, these boiling rocks became family heirlooms. Reliable ones were treasured, reused, and guarded. Drop the wrong stone and you might not just ruin dinner. You might explain to your spouse why a chunk of granite cracked the bowl or splashed boiling broth everywhere. For a society without Tupperware or instant ramen, that was a crisis. And here's the deeper insight. This wasn't just survival. This was low-tech thermodynamics. Peasants didn't need to know the equations, they just needed to know that it worked. Fast forward to today, and this same method is being revived in bushcraft circles and off-grid living tutorials. Because when the lights go out, it's not your microwave that'll save you, it's fire, rock. A knowledge passed down from people who had nothing and still made it work. If part 1 was about turning rocks into kettles, part 2 is about turning mud into Michelin-level flavor, and, believe it or not, it worked so well that it became one of the most efficient, low-cost cooking methods of the medieval world. Enter the forgotten art of clay cooking. Imagine you're a peasant with no oven, no pans, and definitely no stainless steel cookware. You've got a scrawny rabbit or a fish you netted by accident. How do you cook it so that it's not just edible but delicious? The answer lies in dirt. Medieval peasants discovered that if you took clean, soft clay, and coated your meat fur, feathers, scales, and all. You could then toss the whole bundles straight into hot coals. No roasting spit, no pot, just fire and patience. As the clay hardened, it formed a sealed shell, trapping heat and moisture inside. When it was done, you'd crack it open like a prehistoric piñata. And here's the genius part. The hardened shell peeled away everything, the fur, the feathers, the scales. Plucking, gone, gutting, optional. It was like nature's pressure cooker wrapped in a compostable container. The result, meat so tender it slid off the bone, infused with its own juices and the earthy flavor of the fire. Root vegetables could be cooked the same way, soaking up flavors while staying warm and intact. Think about that. Peasants were slow cooking before crockpots were cool. And this wasn't just for desperate survival. It became so refined that some families developed signature clay mixes and offered mud meals as a kind of medieval takeout. They'd accept a chicken from a neighbor, clay wrap it, toss it in the coals, and return it a few hours later, piping hot and delicious. Word got around. The village fool, known more for jokes than judgment, often volunteered as taste tester, not out of bravery, but because it tasted that good. Clay cooking made fools into food, critics and dinner into an art form. But here's the deeper layer. This was sustainable cooking. Clay was free. The firewood was minimal compared to open roasting. Cleanup was nearly non-existent. In today's terms, it was zero waste, energy efficient, and scalable. And while we spend fortunes on Dutch ovens or sous vide machines, they achieved similar effects with nothing but dirt, fire, and time. So what does this teach us? That some of the most sophisticated solutions don't come from advanced technology, they come from people who paid attention to how nature behaves. Seal in heat, slow down the cooking, and let food be food. That's as true in a 21st century kitchen as it was in a 12th century hovel. It also tells us that when you strip away convenience, creativity rises in its place. For medieval peasants, cooking wasn't just about eating, it was about inventing a better way to live with what little they had. If part 2 was about turning mud into magic, then part 3 is about turning crystals into survival gold, because in the medieval world, salt wasn't just a seasoning, it was life insurance. We forget how rare salt used to be. Today, it's in every snack, every sauce, every shelf. But back then, it was so valuable people were literally paid in it, hence the phrase worth your salt. And for peasants with no fridge, no freezer, and no Tupperware, salt preservation was the ultimate hack. Let's set the scene. You've slaughtered your family's pig for the winter. There's no time to waste, because meat spoils fast and you won't get another animal for months. So what do? You layer every slab of meat in coarse salt, like snow around treasure, and pack it into large wooden barrels. Salt draws moisture out of the flesh, and moisture is what bacteria need to thrive. Without it, the rot stops cold. This wasn't just preservation, it was transformation. The meat changed over time, becoming denser, richer, and infused with a cured flavor that was both practical and delicious. It's how modern charcuterie was born, but for peasants, it wasn't. For Instagram, it was survival by the spoonful. And they didn't just dump salt and pray. This was a precise art. Layer after layer, meat and salt like pages in a meat Bible. Peasants learned that coarse sea salt worked better than fine powder, and that rock salt could do in a pinch. Some villagers even formed salt cooperatives, pooling resources to preserve whole pigs, goats, or fish collectively. It was the medieval version of a shared deep freezer. Entire communities leaned on this trick because winter didn't forgive waste. And there's a deeper truth here. Preservation wasn't just about food, it was about hope. To know that you'd have something to eat 3 months from now, even if the weather turned or the harvest failed, was to know that your children might make it through to spring. Salt bought peace of mind, and in a world where one blizzard could cut off your village, that was priceless. It's also worth noting how communal this practice became. Families without enough salt on their own would join forces with neighbors. Some villages built shared storage cellars, where salted meat cured side by side with barrels marked by symbols or initials. This wasn't every man for himself, it was every ham for everyone. That's a kind of social contract we've lost. But maybe we shouldn't have. Even today, people who cure their own meat know this isn't a quick process. It requires discipline, care, patience, and the result is food that doesn't just nourish, it reminds you of the time and trust it took to make. In a modern crisis, with power out or stores empty, salt could once again become the key to survival, not just as a preservative, but as a portal to a forgotten kind of resilience. Peasants understood that in the absence of wealth, preparation was everything, and salt was the first step. If salt was their cold storage above ground, then part 4 takes us underground, literally, because medieval peasants were the original inventors of the natural refrigerator. Long before electric hums filled our kitchens, they called them root cellars. But these weren't just holes in the ground, they were meticulously engineered survival chambers. Picture this. You've harvested your carrots, turnips, onions, and potatoes. If you leave them in the house, they'll rot. If you bury them outside, animals will dig them up. But dig a deep enough pit below the frost line where temperatures remain steady and you suddenly have a microclimate. A cold, dark, moisture-balanced space that keeps food fresh for months. The brilliance here wasn't just in depth, but in detail. Peasants lined their cellar walls with carefully stacked stones to prevent collapse. They covered floors in gravel or sand to absorb moisture and stop pooling. Some even sloped the chamber ever so slightly so condensation wouldn't gather under the baskets. These people didn't have building codes. They had instinct, and that instinct kept them alive. In fact, root cellars weren't just storage, they were strategy. Some were dug into hillsides for added insulation. Others had layered doors, strop-act ceilings, and even primitive ventilation flues to balance airflow. The design varied by region, soil type, and climate, but the goal remained constant. Keep perishables cool, dry, and accessible throughout winter. Think of it as medieval climate control, powered by gravity, geology, and grit. But here's the kicker. These weren't just for vegetables. Butter, cheese, smoked meats, and even preserves were stored down there. Some families had little labeled shelves, not unlike our fridges today, with crocks of lard, cured sausages, and jars of pickled greens resting neatly in shadow. It wasn't glamorous, but it was dependable, and in times of famine or frost, dependability could mean everything. There's also a communal dimension here. Skilled cellar builders became village assets. A well-dug cellar could be rented out or copied. Some peasants even traded labor or goods to have one constructed. And once you had one, it was like owning a walk-in vault. You could store your winter's hope beneath your feet. And when February arrived, cold and cruel, that little underground room could feel like a treasure trove of forgotten abundance. Modern homesteaders are starting to rediscover this. With no energy bills and zero moving parts, root cellars are making a comeback, and not just for doomsday, because no matter how modern we become, the earth still offers a steady P-40 degrees Fahrenheit if you know where and how to dig. So what does this part of the peasant story teach us? That nature, when respected and understood, can be our greatest ally, and that sometimes the smartest innovation isn't something new but something buried, literally and historically, waiting to be unearthed. Root cellars weren't just clever, they were quiet revolutions. Cold, silent, and full of life. If the underground root cellar was a peasant's pantry, then part 5 reveals how they made sure that pantry didn't run dry, because medieval peasants weren't just clever with storage, they were ingenious with water collection, often turning their homes into living rain catchers. Imagine relying on a polluted stream shared with livestock, or a shallow well that dried up midsummer. That was the grim reality for many peasants. But rather than wait for help from nobles or clergy, they looked upward to the sky and turned rainfall into survival. The idea was shockingly simple. Harvest what nature gave freely, using what little you had. Thatched roofs became crude, but effective rain collection systems. Peasants shaped gutters from split logs or hollowed branches, angling them just enough to channel water from rooftop to barrel. These barrels weren't luxury items, they were lifelines, and they weren't just dumped in random corners. They were strategically placed to catch the runoff from multiple sides of the roof. Some homes had entire networks, 5 or 6 barrels linked together, staggered at different heights to maximize collection during storms. But they didn't stop there. Knowing that stagnant water attracts disease and pests, they sealed the barrels with tight wooden lids or cloth wrappings to keep mosquitoes out. To filter debris and make the water more drinkable, they layered cloth, charcoal, sand, and sometimes even crushed brick into rudimentary purification stacks. It wasn't perfect, but it was far safer than scooping water from a trough where cows just drank, or worse. In fact, during dry spells, rainwater often turned out to be the cleanest water available, especially if collected carefully and stored properly. Some peasants even buried barrels partially underground to keep the water cooler and reduce algae growth, inadvertently creating thermal regulation systems modern engineers would applaud. But here's the real brilliance. This water wasn't just for drinking. It was for cooking, washing, brewing, treating wounds, and even mixing with clay for food prep or insulation. Rainwater made every part of daily life more livable. And while medieval people didn't know what bacteria were, they knew dirty water meant death. That's why they observed, tested, and improved their systems generation after generation. Because it was trendy, but because it was vital. What does this tell us? That resilience doesn't come from technology, it comes from intention, from observation, from generations whispering, "This works, so remember it." Today we have smart irrigation, desalination plants, and endless plastic bottles. But in a blackout, a drought, or any disaster scenario, the peasant way of thinking harvest, store, protects becomes not just relevant, but essential. And rainwater becomes not a nuisance, but a gift. One barrel at a time, medieval peasants turned their thatched roofs into lifelines, and their rainy days into blessings. They didn't worship the storm, but they listened to it. And in that, they found their own form of control in a world ruled by chaos. If part 5 showed us how peasants caught life from the skies, part 6 dives into how they healed themselves when life tried to take that breath away, because in a world without modern medicine, medieval peasants turned gardens and kitchens into pharmacies, often with remedies more effective than even they understood. Let's start with garlic and onions, not just flavor makers, but medieval lifesavers. While they didn't know the word antibacterial, they knew something about these pungent bulbs made the sick get better and the wounds heal faster. When illness swept through a household, it wasn't uncommon for a peasant to slice open an onion and leave it out in the sick room, believing it pulled the sickness from the air. And while the science behind that belief might be shaky, here's what we now know. Onions release sulfur compounds that genuinely kill airborne bacteria. So yes, the smell was horrible, but it wasn't superstition. It was rough science in real time. Garlic took it even further. Crushed and applied directly to wounds, garlic acted like an antimicrobial powerhouse. Peasants didn't know the term allicin, but they knew that infected cuts healed better with garlic than without. And so it became the medieval version of Neosporin, passed down mother to daughter, father to son. When sore throats struck, onion syrup mixed with honey, bitter, thick, and aggressive, was administered with a seriousness reserved for last hopes. The sweetness of honey soothed the pain, while its natural enzymes helped kill bacteria. Together, onion and honey formed a sticky alliance that kept many children breathing through brutal winters. And that's the deeper story here. These weren't guesses. These were generations of data collection, trial and error, refined by observation and repetition. When a remedy worked, people remembered. When it didn't, they changed it. Over time, this folk medicine became a survival map, hidden in plain sight, one garden at a time. But it wasn't all internal. Some peasants even wore garlic cloves around their necks to prevent illness. While this had no real medical benefit, it certainly kept others at a distance, perhaps including the germs. Either way, it was defensive, living in a world where one cough could become a death sentence. There's something humbling about this. Peasants didn't have hospitals or vaccines, but they had tools grown from dirt that actually worked. In fact, many of the same ingredients used onion, garlic, honey still show up today in immune-boosting recipes and holistic health kits. But where we often reach for these things in desperation or trend, they reached for them as first response. They trusted what grew close. They learned that healing doesn't always come from a label or a prescription. Sometimes it comes from what's already in your hand if you know how to use it. In their resilience, peasants created a pharmacy of survival where scent and sting were signs that the medicine was working. And that, more than anything, shows the true genius of necessity. If garlic and onions defended the body from within, then Part 7 shows how medieval peasants defended their food not with fences or chemicals, but with an army of spices, weeds, and stingers that kept pests, rodents, and intruders far away from their hard-earned supplies. Because when every crumb counted, you didn't let mice nibble the winter's worth of grain or birds peck at your last loaf of bark bread. Enter one of the smartest, cheapest, and most overlooked medieval tricks: using kitchen spices as pest repellents. Sounds too simple, right? But peasants noticed something: rats, mice, and bugs hated certain smells. So, instead of just seasoning their stews, they started sprinkling chili powder, mustard seed, black pepper, and horseradish powder around the edges of food storage shelves. Think of it as a spice barrier. No walls, no poison, just pain on the pores and nose. A mouse trying to cross a line of cayenne. Like us, face planting into a wasabi cloud. Doable, maybe. Worth it. Not likely. Each pest had its own weakness. Mice hated black pepper. Rats avoided mustard. And many grain-eating bugs simply gave up when confronted with pungent vinegar and spice-soaked cloths wrapped around storage sacks. That's how clever this system was: personalized pest control, using only what was already in the pantry. But the peasants didn't stop with sense. They added sting. Enter the stinging nettler, humble, spiky plant most modern people avoid. But to a medieval peasant, it was a free barbed wire fence, an edible trap, and an alarm system rolled into one. Got a round of cheese or dried meat, wrap it in cloth, surround it with freshly harvested nettles, and hang it from a high beam or tree branch. Not only did this keep the food away from ground predators, but the painful sting of nettles deterred anything with a curious paw or snout. And here's the kicker: nettles were renewable, self-replenishing, and edible once boiled. Talk about a triple threat. In some cases, families even added small bones or hollow gourds to the hanging bundles, so they'd rattle if disturbed. A medieval burglar alarm powered by gravity, biology, and fear of pain. That's innovation. The deeper truth is this: medieval people didn't need to control nature, they collaborated with it. They used scent, sting, and sound to send a message. Two pests, not today. No toxic sprays. No engineered chemicals. Just human observation and the kind of clever problem-solving that comes from living right next to your enemy. And it worked, in an age where spoilage could mean starvation. Protecting food wasn't just wise, it was sacred. Every loaf, every slab of meat, every sack of oats was defended not with wealth, but with wisdom. That's something we could learn from today, because even now, many of these natural repellents still outperform store-bought solutions. We're patient enough to use them right. The medieval pantry wasn't just a place of nourishment, it was a fortress, and its guardians didn't wear armor, they came powdered, pungent, and occasionally prickly. If Part 7 showed us how peasants kept pests at bay, then Part 8 takes us to the edge of desperation, where cleverness gave way to raw survival instinct, and hunger forced people to find nutrition in places modern minds would never imagine. This is the story of bark bread, yes, actual bread made from tree bark. It sounds like a joke, something out of a dystopian novel, but for many medieval peasants, especially during brutal famines, it was the one thing that kept families alive. But they weren't gnawing on firewood like starving squirrels. There was a method to the madness. The key was the inner bark, called the cambium, a soft layer between the tough outer bark and the tree's heartwood. This cambium carried nutrients through the tree, and while it wasn't exactly delicious, it was edible and packed with sugars, starch, and even vitamin C when crops failed, when stored grain ran out, when spring refused to come. Peasants turned to the forest not just for firewood, but for food. They would carefully peel back the outer bark of birch or pine trees, scrape out the cambium in long strips, and then dry it completely before grinding it into a rough flour. That flour would be mixed with whatever grain they could find: oats, rye, barley, sometimes just water and salt, and turned into a dark, bitter, dense bread. Was it pleasant? No. Children cried when it was served, but crying meant they were still alive, and alive was better than the alternative. Some clever cooks tried to improve the flavor with honey, lard, or dried berries if they had any left, turning bark bread from punishment to perseverance. Over time, bark flour became a kind of famine currency. Different trees offered different properties. Birch was sweeter and more palatable, while pine offered medicinal qualities, including vitamin C, which helped fend off scurvy. And that's the genius here. Peasants weren't just foraging, were adapting, creating a food source out of what most people would burn or walk past. They understood that the line between starvation and survival was thin, and bark bread was a bridge across it. What's more, they didn't over-harvest. They learned to strip bark carefully so the tree could live and regrow. Sustainability wasn't a trend, it was instinct, because killing the tree meant closing the door to food for the next crisis. In this act of desperation, there's a haunting kind of brilliance. Imagine being so hungry you start eating your shelter, and then imagine figuring out how to do that without killing the forest or your family. That's resilience. Bark bread may never appear in a cookbook, but it should live in our collective memory. It reminds us that the wild isn't empty. It has layers, literally, and people once knew how to peel those layers back and survive. So the next time we complain about stale toast or the wrong oat milk, maybe remember the ones who lived on bread that grew in silence just beneath the bark. They weren't just eating trees. They were feeding on possibility, one desperate slice at a time. If bark bread showed us how peasants turned trees into emergency food, then Part 9 explores how they transformed the weeds between their toes into beverages of hope and health. Because even in famine, medieval peasants found ways to not only survive but to drink to survival. And no, we're not talking about tavern ale or imported wine, we're talking about nettle beer and dandelion wine, fermented from the wild plants most of us rip from our gardens without a second thought. Let's start with nettle beer. The same stinging nettle used as natural barbed wire and food wrap was also brewed into a mild, nutrient-packed drink, boiled to remove its sting, sweetened with honey or tree sap, and then left to ferment using wild yeast in the air or leftover brewer's yeast. Nettle beer became the daily drink for many peasants. It was safer than river water, richer in iron and calcium than most vegetables, and, most importantly, kept morale up, because nothing breaks a hard week like knowing you've got something to sip by the fire. Then there was dandelion wine. Made from the yellow flowers we now curse on our lawns, dandelion wine was sunshine in a bottle. It required only flowers, water, a sweetener, and time. No vineyards, no fancy tools, just patience and instinct. And while the alcohol content was low, the purpose wasn't intoxication, it was preservation. A way to keep nutrients shelf-stable through the cold months, while giving families a small indulgence to remind them life could still be enjoyed. These weren't luxury drinks. These were medicinal, moral, and memorable. Nettle is loaded with vitamin C, iron, and anti-inflammatory compounds. Dandelion adds potassium, vitamin A, and helps digestion. So each sip was like drinking a multivitamin. Your multivitamin had bubbles and the faint taste of survival. And let's not overlook the deeper point. These drinks were an act of resilience, of finding comfort in the ordinary and community in a shared brew. Every village had its variations. Some added mint or sage, others experimented with dried berries or root extracts. And since the fermentation process didn't require fancy equipment, even the poorest homes could manage a small batch. That's the brilliance. No refrigeration, no bottling plant, no thermometer, just boiled weeds, time, and know-how. And let's not forget, in a world where water could kill you, these fermented drinks could actually save you. So while nobles poured wine from imported casks, peasants raised clay mugs of nettle, brew, and both believed they were drinking something sacred. Today, herbal fermentation is making a quiet comeback, from craft meaderies to kombucha counters. But it's important to remember, peasants were doing this long before it was hip. Not because it was stylish, but because it was sustainable, functional, and soul-soothing. They found sweetness in stingers and joy in weeds. And that perhaps, is the most peasant thing of all, finding life in what others discard. So the next time you curse a dandelion or brush past a nettle, consider this: that plant might have once been the only thing standing between a family and despair. And with the right recipe, it could turn into a toast. If part 9 raised a toast to wild weeds and wisdom, then part 10 brings us inside the peasant home, into the very heart of how they endured winter, not just with warmth, but with comfort crafted from waste. Because when you don't have central heating, insulation, foam, or even thick walls, what do? You get clever with straw, stones, and shared body heat. Let's start with the foundation of medieval comfort, the straw mattress. Forget feather beds or spring coil. Peasants filled large cloth sacks with clean, dry straw, sewn shut and laid directly on wooden platforms or dirt floors. This wasn't just a sleeping surface, it was insulation. The straw trapped heat and created an air buffer, like a primitive memory foam that literally remembered how to keep you from freezing. But that was only half the trick. Families didn't sleep alone. They slept bundled together, head to toe, often in the same bed, not out of affection, but efficiency. Every body was a furnace, and the more of them you lined up, the warmer the room got. Was it cozy? Occasionally. Was it awkward? Frequently. But it was how you made it to spring. And then came the stones. Heated by the hearth and wrapped in thick cloth or rags, they were slipped into beds before nightfall. These were the original hot water bottles, radiating warmth for hours. But they had to be handled with care. One mistake and you'd wake up burnt instead of just cold. Still, for many, this ritual became nightly salvation. Then there was insulation itself. Peasants used every trick in the book, hanging heavy tapestries or cloth over doors and windows, layering walls with dried rushes or animal hair, even draping old cloaks over sleeping areas to create micro-warm zones. Some families even built smaller rooms within rooms, using curtains and partitions so that fewer fires were needed to heat the same space. They didn't try to heat the whole house, they just made sure the bed wasn't an icebox. And let's not forget how strategic they were with their materials. The best straw came from wheat or barleyclean, flexible and less likely to poke. They rotated old straw into compost and replaced it seasonally, maintaining hygiene and comfort without waste. Peasants were zero waste long before hashtags made it cool. Their comfort wasn't about luxury, it was about survival. Yet in their hands, necessity became innovation. These were people who made warmth out of garbage, who found softness in a stable, and in doing so, they built a home not with wealth, but with wisdom. So what does this teach us today? That warmth isn't always found in what you buy, it's in what you build. In how you arrange your space, your family, and your effort. In how you adapt when the fire grows dim. The straw mattress wasn't just a bed, it was proof that you could lie down in hardship and still wake up whole. And sometimes that's all that matters. If part 10 wrapped us in straw and warmth, then part 11 shows us what happened when firewood ran out, forests were too far, and every twig had already been burned, because in those desperate hours, medieval peasants turned to the one fuel source that never ran dry: dung. Yes, animal dung. Cow patties, horse droppings, the byproduct most of us associate with disgust or disposal. Peasants saw it as power, and not metaphorical power. Literal, dependable heat that kept their children from freezing and their stews from going cold. Here's how it worked. Fresh dung was collected, shaped into flat discs or cakes, and left to dry under the sun. These weren't just random piles. They were neatly arranged, carefully spaced, like rows of brown pancakes stacked along fences or on flat stones. The sun did its work, transforming waste into one of the most efficient renewable fuels of the Middle Ages. And here's the surprising part: when dried properly, dung burns slowly, steadily, and with relatively little smoke. Cow dung was especially prized for its slow, consistent burn, making it perfect for cooking over long hours or warming a room without constant attention. Horse dung, on the other hand, burned hotter but faster, more suited for quick tasks or to jumpstart a fire. Think of it like firewood, grades accepted delivered by hooves, not hatchets. Of course, timing was everything. Wet dung, useless, smelly, smoky, and dangerous. But well-dried dung was odorless when burned and essential during wood shortages. Families even became amateur meteorologists, watching the skies to predict dry stretches for dung curing. One unexpected storm could ruin weeks of fuel prep. To protect their supply, peasants stored the dried cakes in sheds, barns, or stacked along inner walls of their homes for double-duty heat when burned, insulation when idle. In some regions, entire house walls were layered with dung patties to keep warmth in and cold out. You don't get more efficient than that. No waste, no expense, no trips to the forest. Just animals doing what animals do, and humans doing what humans do best, adapting. But this wasn't just about fuel. It was about dignity, about refusing to freeze, about looking at the last thing society values and finding in it the one thing you can't live without. There's something deeply poetic in that, something humbling. These people didn't have the luxury of snobbery. They didn't care if it was gross. They cared if it burned, and it did. So the next time your heater clicks on, or your stove flares up, remember, once upon a time, a family lived because they had a cow and a little son. Their fire didn't start with a match. It started with resilience. If part 11 taught us how peasants turned dung into fire, then part 12 brings us to a strange paradox, because in the heart of winter, the very snow that froze their doors and buried their paths could also be their greatest ally. This is the story of snow walls' natural insulation built not in spite of winter, but with it. You see, once medieval peasants realized they couldn't stop the snow, they began to ask, what if we could use it? What if, instead of fighting nature, we wrapped our homes in it? And so began one of the most unintuitive but brilliant survival tactics of the cold season: packing fresh snow against the outer walls of their houses to trap heat inside. Sounds absurd. Not at all. Snow, while freezing, is actually full of trapped air, and air is an excellent insulator. Like a thick wool coat, snow walls reduced heat loss by acting as a thermal barrier between biting winds and fragile wooden walls. Done right, this could cut heat loss by up to 50%, a massive difference when every log counted and the fire had to last the night. But this wasn't just a haphazard pile of snow dumped next to a wall. No, this was architecture. Peasants packed snow in layers, using the perfect balance of pressure to loose, and the wall collapsed. Too tight, and it lost its insulating pockets. They built it like sculptors, smoothing corners, filling cracks, adding new snow as needed. This took time, practice, and teamwork. In fact, some villagers organized snowpacking days, with neighbors helping reinforce each other's homes one after another, like a chain of winter-ready fortresses. And here's the beautiful irony. The storm that threatened their survival was the very thing they used to ensure it. That's peasant logic. Take the problem and turn it into the solution. These snow walls weren't permanent, but they were seasonal saviors, specially for homes made of thin wattle and daub, where heat slipped through faster than you could rebuild it. In some places, snow was packed as high as the eaves, completely encasing the home in a glistening white shell. Children would carve tunnels, peek holes, or even tiny doorways into the packed snow, turning the insulation into a playground as well as protection. When thaw began, they monitored carefully, because melting snow could mean water damage or collapse. But until then, it was as though their home had grown a new skin, cold to the touch, but warm beneath. What does this teach us? That even your enemy, when understood, can become your ally. That fear of the elements can be replaced with respect. And that even the harshest forces can be bent with creativity. These people didn't wait for spring. They turned winter into a tool. They didn't run from the cold. They wrapped themselves in it. That kind of mindset doesn't just keep a house warm, it keeps a spirit alive. If part 12 wrapped homes in snow, then part 13 uncovers what happened after the fire died. The embers cooled, and all that remained was a pile of soft, grey ash. Big. For medieval peasants, ash wasn't waste, it was wealth. They didn't throw it out, they used it, every single bit. Why? Because ash, when understood, became soap, deodorizer, insect repellent, grain protector, even a mild antiseptic. It was like having a medieval multi-tool, dirty, dusty, and absolutely indispensable. Let's start with cleaning. Peasants learned that mixing wood ash with water produced a substance called lye, a basic soap that cut through grease, filth, and even disease. Hands, dishes, laundry, all cleaned with what the fire left behind. No plastic bottles, no perfume additives, just ash and patience. You'd stir the mixture, strain the result, and voila, a gritty but effective cleaner. Harsh on grime, humble in origin. But ash didn't stop at soap. It was also sprinkled in latrines, over chamber pots, and on compost piles to suppress smells and keep flies away. Think of it as the medieval Febreze, scented, unlimited, and unexpectedly effective. Need to protect your grain from bugs. Ash. Again, a fine dusting over stored wheat or oats kept pests at bay by creating an alkaline environment they couldn't survive in. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked. Some families even rubbed a little ash on minor wounds or sore spots to absorb moisture and discourage infection. Was it comfortable? No. Did it sting? Probably. But in a world without bandages or antiseptic creams, you used what you had, and ash was always there. Even its quality varied by wood type. Hardwood ash was rich in lye, perfect for soap. Softwood ash was lighter, better for deodorizing or general use. Over time, families developed a kind of ash hierarchy, this pile for laundry, that pile for the pantry, another reserved for medical emergencies. Imagine living in a time when not even your fireplace trash went to waste. That's the level of resourcefulness we're talking about. They saw value in every handful, and that's the bigger message here for medieval peasants. Survival wasn't just about what you could gather, was about what you could transform. What others saw as soot and useless dust, they saw as solution. It's a mindset we've largely lost. We buy, we toss, we replace. They burned, they repurposed, they remembered. Even after the flame died, the fire served them. And maybe that's the deepest kind of wisdom, when you don't just survive the hard times, but you make even the ashes count. If part 13 sifted through the ashes of resilience, then part 14 takes us back to the core of the peasant spirit, their ability to take nothing and turn it into something that worked, again and again. Because in their world, where every season posed a new threat, every trick had to serve multiple purposes. And what makes this final stretch so powerful is not just the survival strategies themselves, but the mindset that gave birth to them. Let's look at the thread that connects it all. Whether boiling water with stones, baking meat in clay, curing food with salt, insulating homes with snow, or cleaning with ash, medieval peasants weren't randomly improvising. They were experimenting, adapting, refining. Every decision was born from hard-won knowledge and passed through generations, not in books, but in habits. They didn't think of themselves as engineers, yet they built underground, climate-controlled cellars. They weren't herbalists, yet they created immune-boosting syrups and antiseptics from kitchen scraps. They weren't scientists, yet they managed thermal transfer, fermentation, pH control, and microbial resistance without ever naming those things. And that's the lesson. We often think of intelligence as academic, but the peasant's brilliance was applied wisdom, earned not in libraries, but in hunger, hardship, and human observation. They understood seasonality. They respected limitations. They solved problems by leaning into them. When firewood ran out, they burned dung. When pests came, they turned spices into borders and nettles into fences. When illness struck, they reached for what was growing within arm's reach, not what came in a bottle. They worked with what they had, and what they had more often than not was dirt, cold, and time. Yet from that, they pulled meals, warmth, safety, and even celebration. And we must not forget the emotional resilience layered through all of this. These people didn't just survive physically, they created rituals of warmth and togetherness. They shared root cellars. They celebrated fermented nettle beer. They huddled together on straw beds, singing songs beside fires fed by cow patties. In every hardship, they found something that made life just a little more livable. That, in the end, is what survival truly means. Not the absence of death, but the presence of meaning in hard times. And maybe that's what we've forgotten in our age of convenience. That endurance is not just about stocking shelves and downloading apps, it's about understanding our relationship with the natural world. The peasants knew nature isn't the enemy. It's the toolbox, the pantry, the pharmacy, the blanket. And perhaps, if things ever truly fall apart, if the power goes out, if the trucks stop running, if systems fail, what we'll need most isn't another gadget. It's the memory of how to look at the simplest things: mud, weeds, snow, wasteland. Whisper, I can work with this. That is the legacy of the medieval peasant. Not just that they lived, but that they taught us how to. And so, as we close this journey through the forgotten brilliance of medieval peasants, one truth rises above all else. They survived not because they had everything, but because they used everything. The cold didn't break them, it taught them to pack snow into armor. Hunger didn't destroy them, but them to turn bark and nettles into nourishment. Lack of metal, firewood, doctors, tools, these weren't the ends of the road. They were the beginning of solutions. But more than their methods, it's their mindset that should endure. The peasant way wasn't glamorous, it wasn't comfortable, but it was deeply effective. Their knowledge didn't come from theory, it came from need, sharpened into wisdom over generations. Today, we live surrounded by abundance, yet disconnected from the very systems that keep us alive. Our food arrives in plastic. Our heat comes from buttons. Our water flows on command. And when any one of those systems fails, panic replaces instinct. But the peasants had no such luxury. They weren't waiting for help, they were the help. For their families, their neighbors, their future. They proved something we forget. Resilience isn't about having more. It's about needing less unknowing more. And now, as we face climate uncertainty, supply chain instability, energy crises, and digital fragility, their lessons feel less like folklore and more like prophecy. Because the world may not go backward, but it may pause or fracture. And when it does, the ones who remember how to boil water with rocks, to keep warm with straw and snow, to protect food with nettles and ash, those people won't just survive. They'll thrive, quietly, creatively, like peasants once did. So here's your takeaway. The greatest survival tool isn't stored in your garage or sold on a prepper blog. It's your ability to observe, adapt, and appreciate what's already around you. Peasants didn't wait for rescue. They became the rescue. And in doing so, they left behind more than tricks. They left behind a blueprint for living fully even when life is stripped bare. Use it well. Remember them, not as poor, not as backward, but as brave, as brilliant, as the unsung engineers of survival.